Up next, the talk by Christopher Lopez will be asking questions and writing effectively. And in Christopher's bio of himself, he was talking about how through his career, what he's found that has been the thing that has enabled him to progress is to effectively ask questions. And so he's going to be talking about investigation and investigative methodology and communication. And this is something that I excuse me, I personally value tremendously when people are able to write well and when people have taken the time to be inquisitive in order to try to cover as much information as they possibly can. So Christopher, are you on and ready to go?
Okay, ready to go. Thank you so much.
Please take it away. Thank you.
Get started. Yes, as stated, the topic is going to be about asking questions and writing effectively. This is one of my favorite topics, so let's just kind of dive right into it. So who am I? First of all, I'm a father. Been a SOC analyst for a few years now, and definitely on the side, the blue team side of things. And if I were to say I had any kind of superpower, it is the ability to ask questions. Now, that was something that I had to learn. So anyone can do it. So the agenda, we're going to talk about investigative questions and how you use those questions to write an effective, to create an effective write-up, because that is the end goal of your analysis. That is how your work is reflected, is through your write-ups. So asking the right questions will help you make that more effective. So let's dive into it. Tools to be an awesome investigator. Here's the best part. There's not that much needed. You need your mind, questions, biases, perspectives, everything about yourself. You need to bring that with you. Somewhere to take notes. I still use pen and paper as I'm writing and answering questions about an investigation. It's effective for me. But of course, any text editor, anywhere you can copy paste information into is fine. A loosely defined process. The reason I say loosely defined here is because I feel like the more structured the process of investigation is, the less there is the ability for an analyst to be creative. There's a lot in an investigation that requires some creativity. So loosely defined, in my opinion, of course. So team members. Now, I've been very lucky in my career and I've had amazing team members that I can lean on during an investigation. And that is key to, knowing how you're doing and whether or not there's improvements that you can make. So lean on your team members. Now, the investigation engine. Of course, this is your questions, which lead to how you collect artifacts. I put rabbit holes in here because they're common and it's just good to be aware that you may be going down a rabbit hole, and that's fine. Just know when to, take yourself out of it. Compile your findings after you've collected your artifacts, you form a conclusion, and of course, your documentation. That is the engine that most of us use during our investigations. Now, if you notice, it's actually very similar to the scientific method. And the reason for that is because we're not recreating the wheel with the way that we investigate things. We're still relying on these basic, well-vetted processes to be able to answer questions, right? We're trying to figure out what happened, how bad is it, and trying to learn more about, how that specific investigation works. So these are the questions that we're going to focus on: the what, the why, the when, the where, the who, and the how. We've been hearing this since elementary school, but they're still incredibly important, during an investigation. So we're going to get started with the what. Now, the what is interesting because this is essentially your input, right? So in this presentation, since I'm a SOC analyst, I'm going to come, with that perspective. I'm going to focus a little bit more on, rule alerts and detections. But of course, your input can be a threat hunt idea. You saw something interesting on someone's talk. You want to see whether or not that exists in your environment. You want to look for it. A recent breach report. We've been seeing a lot of those, unfortunately, but that may be a great input. And of course, things change. So a new organizational process can happen. A lot of companies are moving to the cloud. What does that introduce? What should you look for? What is any visibility gaps that you have? That can spark an investigation on its own. And these are all just inputs. And it's good to ask yourself what it is that you're doing in the first place. Now, this is something that took me some time to really understand, and it threw me many curveballs, and I went down many rabbit holes without understanding this specific thing, and that is question the what. So when we're talking about an alert, question the alert first. Really think about whether or not the alert logic makes sense. There are detection rules that are created, by people in your team or people that may leave your team. In a SOC, that is commonplace. People are moving around, and that's just part of it. Just be aware of what the alert is actually trying to find, and did it find it? And is there any documentation around that, right? That's incredibly important. Is there a wiki? Is there like, hey, this rule is trying to find this thing and it's scoped out to this specific part of our environment? Like, that's important context, because I've spent countless time looking at an investigation or an alert or starting an investigation, and I would have saved a lot of time by simply asking, does this make sense? Does this alert actually make sense with what I found? Very important. So let's talk about the why. Why did this happen? And this is all about building your hypothesis. This is incredibly important, just like in the scientific method process. This is what drives your investigation. I still do this, especially when I'm working on something new that I haven't seen before and I'm interested in what's going on. I still use a pen and paper to write down my hypothesis. Something as simple as, I don't think this actually executed. Something like that. So of course, from here, you're going to ask your questions, to find the answers, to understand the context behind this investigation more. Building your hypothesis is very important. Leslie said it fantastically in a recent Wild West Hacking Fest, that was like a couple weeks ago, about how to build your hypothesis and what you should rely on to do that. And there's just 3 simple questions. Yes, there's a lot about questions in here. So 3 more questions to build your hypothesis. Is it falsifiable, right? Is it testable? And what is the scope? Even though the conversation Leslie had was more about threat hunting, it is still present here with building a hypothesis when you're, actually trying to embark on an investigation. So spend some time and really think about those. And this is an example. This is something that, it happens a lot, right? AV detects something that may be malicious in a user directory, and your hypothesis would be, this is an example, the file did not execute, right? AV was successful in, quarantining or deleting this file. And what you'll do from there is try to pull artifacts and evidence to prove yourself wrong. Proving yourself wrong is much easier, I've experienced, than proving yourself right. So that's the way that I approach it. Now, the when. This is another one that's incredibly important. Another one that can cause a huge time waste during an investigation is if you're not really aware of the timestamps. If you're not aware of what it means between your SIM time, right? Where it is that you're pulling this data and the actual endpoint itself, if it is an endpoint related investigation. I remember I was looking for evidence of a process create event on a machine, and I saw it in the SIM and it was set to Eastern time, right? I am in Eastern time. And the machine actually ended up being in Asia. And I pulled logs that I felt were not available in the SIM. And I was going through the logs looking for evidence of this. And I was looking in the completely wrong time. I spent at least an hour looking in the wrong place until I remembered to look to see, where this machine is located. And that's the point of the next question, asset location. Sometimes this can be answered with the when. It's important to understand and to have some kind of asset management system in place. And of course, if this is an investigation that is tied to a user, understanding the user location is important as well. Let's say that you need to reach out to a user, for example, to understand something that may have happened. You need to be mindful of, if they're going to be online at that time, if they're going to be present to answer your question. Understanding the where is incredibly important to, facilitating that need in the investigation. Who? We spoke a little bit about a user, and I want to speak about a user account for a second. There's some talks about attribution, threat intelligence, about how answering the who. Answering the who, in my experience, can be difficult. And it's also really important to understand that when you're dealing with a user account, it is a user account. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is the user. There's a level of abstraction within that artifact, and it's important to understand that when you're trying to answer the who. It's also important when you're writing up this investigation to make that very clear that you're referencing a user account, not a user. It's very hard to imagine that most of us, and especially in this remote work life that we're having now, that you're standing behind somebody and actively seeing what they're doing, where you can definitely say that that is that person that committed that action. That's very hard. So just be aware that a user account is an abstraction. But it is important to ask these questions, right? To have some level of attribution, to understand whether or not this is an insider or outsider like activity, and also to understand whether this is a employee, vendor, coworker. Mistakes happen. You can be testing something and it might fire an alert for a machine. Understand the who behind the investigation. How? This is, to me, the most enjoyable part, and that is understanding how things work, right? So that's something as simple as, how did this get here? And now, going back to the AV detection, let's say that the AV, the antivirus was able to quarantine that file that was in that suspicious user directory. Well, I'm more interested in how did that get there and why was it there, right? Yeah, so AV captured it and the threat is gone technically, but why was it there in the first place? So that's where this question really comes into play, right? Another good question to ask is, how did we detect this? Because as a SOC analyst, one of the main goals is to continue to improve your detection capabilities, which in turn improve your security posture, right? So how do we detect this? And is this something that we can improve the detection on? That's also an incredibly important question to ask. And how does this work? Now, that last question there, I spent a lot of time on that just because I'm curious, and a lot of us in this field are curious. But it's important to understand that because maybe there's something within this investigation based on your understanding of how it works that you can potentially build another detection for in the future. And of course, one of the most important questions here to ask yourself as you're going through an investigation is, how impactful is this to the organization? And this usually ends up with, do I need to invoke some kind of IR functionality because I have determined that this is of high severity or high enough severity to escalate this investigation. Okay, so now we have a rough set of notes on whichever note-taking app or paper you have. Now we need to talk about putting all of that together. And I'm gonna say this probably 2 more times or more. It's really important. And analyst efforts are reflected through their documentation. That is what your leadership sees. More than what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis, right? So it's important to include things like, what actions did you take? This one specifically is very important because as we grow and become better analysts, it's important for any of our coworkers or anyone that we may have a lead analyst, for example, that reviews our investigations. There may be some room for improvement. What actions did you not take, right? Like, that's something very interesting, to build, the skill set of a SOC. So when did you take these actions, right? That's also incredibly important. What answers did you obtain, right? Sometimes I'll use this as a template. I'll put out all the questions on a Word document, and I'll put the what, why, when, all that, etc. And I'll use those as headings just to guide how it is that I'm presenting the information. And of course, you're going to clean that up, right? So is escalation required or was it, right? That's very important. What is your conclusion? Now, as analysts, that is one of the most important functions that we have, is being able to provide our conclusions based on our investigation and based on what it is that we've uncovered. So is it a false positive? Is it a true positive? Is it a false negative? Can you say that confidently? And what does that mean for your investigation? And what does that mean for additional alerts that you may investigate that are related or are similar? Very important to put that into the write-up So the next point here is always include a bluff. And this is something that I had a lot of difficulty with when I was first starting to, do more investigative write-ups. I didn't include a bluff, and you have to really understand your audience when it comes to, creating a write-up. And a bluff basically is your bottom line up front, right? Make it clear what it is that whomever the reader is getting themselves into and why it matters, why they're reading it, why should they, click on this email to look at it. People are busy, right? So that's just something to keep in mind when it is that you're writing something up. And the last point here, provide contextual data, right? So I think that this enriches a write-up document, which is provides timestamps. So let's say that this is a file-related investigation and we're dealing with process level artifacts. And I want to know when a process did something or when a file was dropped in some location. Provide timestamps. That enriches your document. And user and endpoint information that can be answered with the where and the when questions, but it's also important to add those artifacts properly in your write-up. And of course, OSINT data to support your claims, right? If this file is bad, what else is out there in relation to this file? What did you uncover? Why is it bad? Well, what does it do? Of course, it's important to put all of this in a section of the write-up that's more the technical details aspects of it, so that whomever is reading this can go and look to that section if they want more contextual data, if they want more understanding about the investigation. So like I said, the bluff was a hard one for me, so I always like to emphasize it. And number one part of writing a bluff is understanding your audience. Who's reading this, right? If this is just between you and your SOC team, it's perfectly fine. I mean, the bluff can be, how cool this was and like how we improved our detections because of this. Like, that's really awesome. That makes sense for that audience, right? But if this is for your leadership that may have to make a decision based on your investigation, it's important to provide all the questions that you feel they would ask up front. Bottom line up front. That's the whole point of this. And I try to follow this method here. It's called the 3 C's. And I still have some trouble with this, and it's something I work on every day. Try to be concise, clear, and correct. Concise, make it quick to read, make it make sense. Clear, use active voice. Don't use your passive voice when you're writing. And correct, really double check what it is that you're saying. And if you're making a determination on something, be confident in what it is that you're saying. All right, so we're going to talk about the importance one last time. The reason I stress this is because write-ups can invoke change in an organization, right? So let's say that you found something that was very bad and you presented this to your leadership, and they're going to make a decision based on this. Write your write-ups with that in mind. Write it with the expectation that someone can forward this, right? So that they don't have to work on editing or revising it. Write it as if it can be forwarded and it's good to go. Another important thing about a write-up, and something that I really enjoy when I'm reading someone else's, is how can I replicate the actions you took? Is it possible based on what you wrote up? Like, can I understand where you pulled certain information from and how it is that you came up with this, determination, whether or not it's false positive or true positive or whatever it is that, you decided as an analyst this is. Can I replicate that, right? And of course, the importance, it goes back to improvements in the SOC and the overall org. Is this something that we can improve our detection capabilities with? And of course, at the last point, I really love this. This is something that I try to do a lot. I probably write too much, but it's okay. Document your findings and or conclusions in some sort of wiki, whatever knowledge base it is that your team uses, that your team, is involved in actively and editing and, making new cool things in. Make sure that you put your investigations in there to some capacity so that others can learn from what it is that you're doing, right? You want to try to not have to reinvent the wheel for every single investigation when someone can go read your analysis and be like, oh, this looks very similar to that. So I understand, this way of investigating, and you can branch off of that thought process. All right, so I want to just throw in some resources here at the very end. If you're interested in thinking about thinking and the investigative process, Chris Sanders' investigation theory course is fantastic. It's something that I always suggest to anyone that's interested in this type of material. If you want to learn about how to generate a fantastic hypothesis, well, SANS has some excellent white papers on that. And the one here by Robert Lee about, successful threat hunting is amazing. If you want to check your biases, which we didn't really cover here, I talked about it maybe once or twice. If you want to understand how your perspective on something can affect your analysis, thinking fast and slow is something that was really helpful for me to understand my own biases. And for writing, the Communicating with Intelligence book here, it's funny, this is something that was in my graduate course, and it's been really groundbreaking for me to improve my writing. All right, well, thank you. That's all I have. And if there's any questions, we're going to be having the forum later on for all the collective questions.